By mid-July 1944, Nazi Germany was in an increasingly desperate situation. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was pressing the German forces back into Poland. In Italy, the Allies had entered Rome and were advancing northwards. In France, the German army was struggling to contain the Anglo-American forces in Normandy. Ultimate defeat was staring Germany in the face. In the eyes of some army officers and leading civilians, only Adolf Hitler stood in the way of an end to Germany's suffering. On July 20th, 1944, a bomb planted by these conspirators exploded in a conference room at Hitler's eastern headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia. The target was Hitler himself. The conspirators, believing that Hitler had been killed, tried to seize the organs of government in Berlin. They were arrested, and many of them were later defendants in a show trial. Most were executed. Theirs was the last in a long line of attempts to remove Hitler from power. The failure of the July 1944 bomb plot was the result of a series of blunders. This mistake-ridden attempt to eradicate Hitler meant that the war would continue to drag on indefinitely. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, the general belief among centrist politicians was that he and his Nazis could be controlled. They would soon realize that the opposite was the case. On the night of February 27, 1933, there was a fire at the German Parliament building, the Reichstag. Hitler accused the communists of starting the blaze and used this as an excuse to purge all left-wing parties. In August 1934, Germany's presidential figurehead, the venerable Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, died. This was to mark the end of democracy in Germany. Hitler made himself absolute dictator, and all political opposition was crushed. The army might have stood in Hitler's way, but Hitler's political army, the brown-shirted SA, threatened its primacy in the defense of the Reich. SA leader Ernst Röhm was murdered on the orders of Hitler, who saw him as a potential rival. This also removed the threat of the army, but it would eventually have to pay a price. War Minister Werner von Blomberg was duped by Hitler into ordering all ranks of the armed forces to swear a personal oath of loyalty to the Führer rather than to the German state. Nurtured on the precepts of honor, duty, loyalty, the army was trapped into becoming Hitler's personal vassal. Hitler now embarked on a policy of expansionism, which began in March 1936 with the entry of German troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, a flagrant breach of the 1919 Versailles Treaty. 2 years later came the union with Austria, which fell under the Nazi sway. Hitler now turned his eyes on Czechoslovakia, demanding that the westernmost province of Sudetenland, which contained a significant-sized ethnic German population, be handed over to Germany. He was prepared to use force to gain the province, and some senior German officers began to fear that Hitler's expansionism might lead to an all-out war in Europe and prove disastrous for their country. General Ludwig Beck wrote a memorandum to fellow senior officers expressing his concern and resigned as Army Chief of Staff. His successor, Franz Halder, agreed with Beck and felt that something must be done. His concern increased as the Czechs mobilized and demonstrated their intention of resisting Hitler's demands, and war seemed ever more inevitable. Halder began to actively plot against the Führer. He drew up a plan with Colonel Hans Oster and General Erwin von Witzleben to storm the Chancellery and kill Hitler. It was to be the first of many plots against the Führer's life. The European powers forced Czechoslovakia to hand over Sudetenland in return for a pledge by Hitler to make no further territorial demands. Halder therefore ceased his plotting. But Hitler broke his promise, and in spring 1939 turned on neighboring Poland. War threatened once more, and a largely civilian and communist-inspired group, which the Gestapo called the Red Orchestra, was formed. When Moscow and Berlin signed a pact in late August 1939, the Red Orchestra was thrown into confusion and took no action. The swift success of the invasion of Poland and the natural German antipathy towards that country also temporarily stilled the resistance to the Nazi regime. But immediately after the crushing of Poland, Hitler demanded an invasion of France and the Low Countries. Many of his generals were aghast and feared for Germany's future. Once again, groups began to actively plot against Hitler, but their efforts would ultimately end in disaster. Admiral Wilhelm Carneris, head of German military intelligence, was very worried over Hitler's plan to attack the West. He conferred with Army Commander-in-Chief Walter von Brauchitsch as to what they should do. All they could come up with was excuses for delaying the invasion. Some of Carneris' staff then hatched a plot to kill Hitler with a bomb. Nothing came of this. But in November 1939, there was a dramatic development from an entirely different quarter. It was the anniversary celebration of Hitler's abortive 1923 push in Munich, which saw the first real attempt on Hitler's life. A lone assassin left a bomb at a beer house where Hitler was to make a speech. This was shorter than expected, and he left the building before it went off. The result was a tightening of security, and the various resistance groups were forced to lie low. The invasion of the West eventually went ahead in May 1940, and the dazzling victories of the next 2 years cowed the plotters. Not until the German surrender at Stalingrad in early 1943 did the plotters once more seriously begin to contemplate the death of Hitler. The main group, known by the Gestapo as the Black Orchestra, consisted of both soldiers and civilians. The figurehead was Ludwig Beck, but it also included Ulrich von Hassel, formerly German ambassador to Rome. Karl Gödler, ex-mayor of Leipzig. Theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. General Henning von Treschow, Chief of Operations of Army Group Center on the Eastern Front. Von Witzleben, now retired as a field marshal. And Count von Helldorf, head of the Berlin police force. Two other groups were loosely associated with them. One of them was led by Helmut von Moltke, great-grandnephew of the victor of the 1870 war against France. Another was built around a circle of young diplomats in the German Foreign Office. Apart from the lack of coordination between and within the groups, they suffered other shortcomings. They were not used to leading clandestine lives and often committed elementary breaches of security, including keeping diaries and talking openly on the telephone. The Black Orchestra itself was also widely scattered. The plotters' efforts to obtain the active support of the senior commanders at the front, men like Field Marshal Gert von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, and Eastern Front commanders Field Marshal Hans Gunther von Kluge, and Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, also failed. The generals of the old Prussian school considered their oaths of loyalty to be unbreakable. As von Manstein remarked, Prussian field marshals do not mutiny. The plotters also used neutral Stockholm, Sweden to approach the British and opened communications with the Americans for help via Switzerland. But the Allies would not take them seriously, especially since they knew that the plotters did not have the backing of the German military top brass. The plotters were undeterred. During 1943, there were a number of bungled attempts on Hitler's life, including the placing of a brandy bottle filled with explosive on his aircraft. It failed to detonate, leaving Hitler ignorant of its existence. Finally, in summer 1944, by which time the Germans were under pressure on every front and defeat was becoming ever more inevitable, a workable plan for killing Hitler finally emerged. The key player was Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, a staff officer and devout Roman Catholic who had been badly wounded in Tunisia. He obtained a post in the headquarters of the replacement army in Berlin, a job which necessitated visits to Hitler's field headquarters at Rastenburg, East Prussia, the so-called Wolf's Lair. Von Stauffenberg would take a bomb concealed in a briefcase to a briefing session for Hitler and leave it under the table. While most of the senior combat commanders refused to support the plan, the plotters still hoped that one might join them. It was Erwin Rommel, who had for some time been idolized by the Nazi propaganda machine and was probably better known to the German people than any other general. But Rommel was in charge of the desperate battle taking place in Normandy. Although he believed the war in the West to be lost, Rommel could not bring himself to join the plot while he was embroiled in trying to hold back the Allies. However, on July 17th, he was severely wounded by a marauding Allied fighter and was in no condition to participate. By now, the plotters were in the final stage of their preparations to kill Hitler. Although they did not recognize it at the time, Rommel's wounding was an ill omen for the conspiracy. On July 20th, 1944, Klaus von Stauffenberg succeeded in planting his bomb at the Hitler conference. He left the conference early and flew back to Berlin without checking whether Hitler was dead. The bomb did go off when Hitler was in the room. Hitler survived without any serious injury. While the bomb killed some and wounded others who had been present at the meeting, von Stauffenberg blundered by placing it on the wrong side of the table leg. This shielded Hitler from most of the blast. Indeed, he was fit enough to meet Benito Mussolini later that day and to show him the wreckage of the conference room. But the plotters did not initially know this. Von Stauffenberg had arrived back at the replacement army headquarters in Berlin and tried to organize the takeover of key points in the city. He also sent messages to all Wehrmacht headquarters. Only General Karl Heinrich von Stuffnagel, a member of the Black Orchestra and military governor of Paris, took any action. He arrested all SS and Gestapo personnel in the French capital. Back in Berlin, a key element of the push was the crack Großdeutschland Guard Battalion commanded by Major Otto Ernst Reimer. The most important of this unit's tasks was to arrest Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. But when Reimer arrived at his office, Goebbels called the Wolf's Lair and established that Hitler was still alive. Reimer recalled the oath he had sworn to the Führer and immediately changed sides. The push now rapidly unraveled as Goebbels mounted a counter-coup. General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the replacement army who had dithered over joining the plotters, arrested von Stauffenberg. Together with his boss, General Friedrich Olbricht, and others, von Stauffenberg was shot that night without any attempt to mount a trial. In Paris, von Stuffnagel and his supporters were also arrested after releasing their opponents. Hitler ordered von Rundstedt to preside over a court of honor for those suspected plotters who were serving officers. This was because traditionally a civil court could try no German officer. Those who were suspected of complicity were expelled from the armed forces so that they could be tried. Those who were aware of the conspiracy but had taken no part were also drawn into the net. Rommel, still recovering from his wounds, was eventually forced to commit suicide after the Gestapo threatened a dire fate for his wife and son. It was officially announced that Rommel had died of his wounds and was given a state funeral. Günther von Kluge, who had recently taken over as Commander-in-Chief West, was summoned back to Germany and also committed suicide while en route. As for the remainder, they were victims of a show trial presided over by the notorious Nazi judge Roland Friesler. Tortured beforehand and humiliated by the court, the defendants knew that there would be only one verdict. Some did escape when the court building was bombed in February 1945, killing Friesler himself. Most of those found guilty were hanged from meat hooks in Berlin's Plötzensee prison. The executions were filmed for Hitler's benefit. The conspirators themselves represented some of the finest of Germans. But because they were idealistic by nature, they lacked the necessary ruthlessness to ensure that their aim of ridding Germany of Hitler was achieved. Their blunders were essentially those of amateurism. and it was this that spelt failure. As brave as they were, the conspirators' abortive efforts merely meant that the Nazi regime exerted an even tighter hold over the country. There was to be no chance of another attempt on Hitler's life being made. Only when the Russian guns were pounding at the center of Berlin did he eventually take his own life. But by that time, Germany was almost a wasteland. And her people had lost everything.